So next up is Markus Gaasedelen. He's going to be presenting on a really, really cool story of his years of research into the Xbox, the original Xbox. He kind of runs the gamut from deep hardware to software, and it was such an enjoyable story when he dry run it. Jordan and I were just fascinated the whole time. So we think you'll find it just as intriguing. So please welcome Markus.
All right, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for making it back from lunch and staying through this far into the conference here. So my name is Markus Gaasedelen, and this is full stack reverse engineering of the original Microsoft Xbox. So this is a deeply personal story for me, and it's a fleeting glimpse at about 4,000 hours of hobbyist research. Obviously, nobody is paying my company to research the original Xbox. We have better things to do. But these 4,000 hours capture about 3 years I spent in this dark, windowless home office, which slowly spiraled into this full-blown lab hosting dozens of hardware and software projects pertaining to the original Xbox. I made a number of significant technical breakthroughs on the software side for the original Xbox, but for the purpose of this talk, I'm just going to focus predominantly on a handful of hardware-oriented projects that kind of tricked me into becoming an electrical engineer of sorts. So who am I? I'm a security researcher by trade. I have an extensive background in reverse engineering, program analysis, boutique exploitation. I used to play CTS a long time ago as part of RPISec, but I'm probably best known for my IDA plugins. So people that have used Lighthouse or Tenet or the patching plugins or the AVX research, that's me. So yeah, now I try to focus on just problems that I personally find interesting. But my last conference talk was 6 years ago at CCC in Germany in 2018. I came out of retirement specifically to support this conference and my friends, and I'm so incredibly proud to be here. But the talk I gave at CCC back in 2018 illustrated the tedious process of developing zero-day exploits for browsers. But what do 0 days have to do with the original Xbox, and why should all of you folks care about hardware? So this small room is filled with, 100 of some of the best, most proficient software reverse engineers. But most of you also probably double as vulnerability researchers. And for those that don't know anything about vulnerability research, we often search for bugs or clever asymmetries, as some more formal people like to call them, that we can abuse to take full control of software and systems. But it's always kind of bothered me that the small cabal of researchers producing the most elaborate software gymnastics often lack any understanding of hardware. It almost feels disrespectful to our trade in a sense. You spend 12 hours sitting at a computer each day. Don't you want to know how they work? And so I won't be able to distill 4,000 hours of technical hardware concepts I learned over these years into a 1-hour technical talk. This is just really the tip of the iceberg. But all the specifics I learned tumbling down this rabbit hole, you're going to have to go learn on your own. But yeah, if you go as deep as I did and you make it back here, you might start seeing these unique asymmetries that neither domain will recognize in total isolation. I think there's a real chance it might change the way that you think about exploiting software runtimes that maybe previously you thought might be impossible. And so poking undocumented MMIO registers to tweak CAS latencies and RAM that could serve as some primitive to induce memory corruption in otherwise perfect code, or how raising the temperature of a chip might actually make your race condition more reliable. If you don't believe me, that's also okay. I hope this talk at least encourages you to try to do some things that are far outside your existing skill set. So this is a high-level agenda of the talk. I'll provide a bit of background on the console, some general purpose tips to get you interested in hardware, and then cover a variety of increasingly ludicrous hardware projects I tackled along the way. So yeah, let's talk about the original Xbox. It launched in 2001. This was Microsoft's first venture into the console industry. It's best known for Halo, Master Chief, Xbox Live, LAN parties, getting online play viable at home on a console. But under the hood, the system was effectively a streamlined personal computer of the early 2000s. It had a DVD drive, an 8 GB hard drive. It was an Intel-based motherboard with a purpose-built NVIDIA GPU, which also doubled as its North Bridge. And for reference, this is kind of like the system architecture. We'll revisit this diagram several times throughout this presentation, so I don't want to spend too much time here for now. But yeah. But yeah, this console is part of my origin story. When I was 12 years old in the mid-2000s, I managed to get my hands on this book, Hacking the Xbox by Bunny, Andrew Wang. And it was followed by vivid memories of soldering in mod chips into my Xbox. I was, solder fumes everywhere. I'm like trying not to damage my Xbox, but eager as can be, after learning a little bit of the hardware and getting the mod chip in my Xbox, I started opening Xbox game executables in IDA 4.9. I had no idea what x86 assembly was. I didn't even know how to program yet, but I was trying, and that's kind of like a common theme of this talk. You just got to throw yourself out there and start doing stuff. Oops. So yeah, over the past 20 years, though, some really incredible first-party resources for the original Xbox have leaked out onto the internet. This includes a complete mid-development snapshot of the Xbox source tree from 2002, as well as full hardware schematics, a number of the original design documents that Microsoft used when manufacturing the Xbox. And from an educational point of view, it's a complete goldmine. Like, imagine getting to study low-level OS programming, thread scheduling, memory management, hardware I/O on a real-world consumer device with its original production code base. It's actually like freaking incredible. So yeah, the leaked source tree is completely self-contained, basically just builds out of the box. It's kind of surreal that you could think of something that complex. It's like, imagine being like, oh, let me just build Windows on my machine. That's kind of what's going on here. And so there's a few little things you got to do to get it working on hardware, but it's such an awesome, amazing resource to just read through the code and just like, not even if you, I don't know, NT code is some of the most beautiful code in the world, in my opinion. But yeah, this is a screenshot of me building the BIOS from early April 2021. The source tree leaked into the hands of hackers, though, about 20 years ago, and this is what really kicked off the whole homebrew scene for the original Xbox back in the day. Nobody knows exactly where it came from. Some say it was an intern at Microsoft that stole it. Others claim it was a breach. It doesn't really matter at this point, but it's a snapshot of the entire tree tagged as build 4400, and so sometimes it's called the 4400 leak. And it's a pretty fun exercise, too, to just go through and diff that source tree against the various production ROMs that got shipped on the Xboxes, and like go through and port your patches or like try to reverse engineer the binary fixes that they made later in development back to the source tree. But yeah, this slide provides a high-level overview of the BIOS. It's more for reference for those that want to flip through this in the future. We're not going to talk too much about software again. We're going to keep moving in the interest of time. So I promised a talk that illuminated my journey as a software researcher, learning to go deep on hardware. So let's flip over to actually working with hardware. This is kind of what my hardware bench looked like pretty early on. I'd actually strongly recommend getting things like an oscilloscope, which you see on the right side there, and like the BGA station on the left. Like those are some, well, the oscilloscope I purchased early on, but like until you know what you're doing, I would say hold off on this. This is what I would recommend is like your starter lab, $1,000. You don't need to spend more than that, like, and you can get like the best equipment for doing the most mechanical things. And this is not Xbox specific in any way. This applies to every single device research that you will do if you're popping embedded targets or researching other things. This is $1,000 goes a long, long way. So if you're at this conference, I know you or your employer can 100% afford $1,000 to change your life. So, and another thing I want to stress to you is just, I highlighted in red, but get a good trinocular microscope because it makes everything way easier. Even if you're soldering or not just inspecting the board and like doing different things, like you will become a 10 times better like hardware person just by having a good microscope. So spend $500 up front or whatever. Actually you can buy this exact one. This is exactly what I have. And so, yeah. But getting started into hardware hacking, like you really should just start practicing with soldering stuff to whatever board or target you're looking at. On the Xbox, it's very common to like solder to this point, which is called the D0 point, and on the left side, there's also the LPC header. Sometimes there's quick solder boards that people would solder onto the board to tap certain points and reroute certain signals. And this is all just getting familiar with soldering, using flux, cleaning up the board with isopropyl alcohol and stuff like that. And yeah, being able to install pin headers is a big trait, or a big like common skill of just basic hardware hacking, be it playing around with Xbox, or if you're researching some device that has a debug, some unpopulated debug port, yeah, you're going to want a solder header on there so you can like easily put logic analyzer probes on there or do other things with it. For reference, this is a mod ship that I use for about 99% of my research, doing the software kernel hacking side of things. I could easily flash it over the network to load new custom BIOS images that I was compiling via the source tree, allowing me to iterate pretty quickly and play around with the hardware. Historically, one of the most advanced Xbox mods that normal people will do is trying to solder extra RAM chips onto the motherboard in place of the unpopulated pads. And so you could actually upgrade your console from 64 megabytes to 128 megabytes of RAM. Yeah, it's kind of a fun achievement to be like, oh, I've hand soldered RAM chips before. But then it can get even crazier. Someone actually realized for the final revision of Xbox where they removed the extra RAM pads, you can actually stack the RAM chips on top of each other and just route the chip select line. And apparently there's some precedence for this in history, and so this is kind of like a zoomed in version. But yeah, you know, it's like, I remember when I showed a friend this picture, they were like, do you have hands of a surgeon? Like, what is going on? So let's get into actual, instead of just the fundamentals and just the mechanical process of soldering things, how I started getting into the hardware engineering side. So when I was doing all this research, I usually had just one retail unit sitting on my desk. You don't need a development kit. You don't need a debug kit. Don't spend your money on that. I did almost all my work on retail units. And I had this little board on the front of it. You can see on the front left there, it's this little USB board hanging off. But every now and then, my kernel debugger kept getting stuck for some reason. It kept hanging. And I'd see the board just flashing the RxTX like crazy. And to give it a little bit more context, this is basically an Xbox serial USB adapter. It outputs UART from it. It essentially lets you get UART out of the console pretty easily into USB. So then you could just like connect to use PuTTY or something on Windows, or specifically, I would hook up WinDebug. And so you could kernel debug using WinDebug 4.0. You could actually debug the Xbox kernel. Yeah, this is just flipping back a slide. This is actually how I routed it out. And so I'd put the mod chip on the ribbon cable, and I would route out the front so I had easy access to the USB. But yeah, if you want to experience a total fever dream, you could even do source debugging or with the latest WinDebug preview. Debugging a 20-year-old console with source and symbols, like it's a total trip. But anyway, going back to that little serial adapter, what happened is it was getting stuck for some reason. My WinDebug sessions would just hang sometimes when I was dumping a lot of memory. And so I started like trying to figure out what was going on, and I started trying to figure out how to use this oscilloscope I'd actually bought like 2 or 3 years prior. And oscilloscopes are kind of advanced when you're a software person. You don't really know the hardware side of things. But I started probing signals, and essentially what you're seeing is like the purple signal, this is like one of the LPC signals, which will go to that little serial board. The purple signal at the top is what that signal was on the board, like on the motherboard itself. But then the yellow is at the end of my ribbon. And I started learning and asking around, talking to my EE friends, and they're like, oh, well, this is called ringing. Go read about this stuff. And so I started learning a little bit more of like the analog topics of hardware. And if you actually go to that issue on GitHub, you'll see my process. It's almost like a blog post kind of unrolled of me trying to figure out what the hell's going on and me answering my own questions because nobody else was answering my questions. And so there's more pictures and stuff there. But yeah, I essentially had to open KiCad, which is this PCB design tool, essentially. And it's most commonly used by hobbyists for doing hobbyist hardware engineering of any sorts. At first, I didn't like it. I was trying to be like, oh, I want to go learn Altium or Eagle, like the high-end IDA pros of like but it's like, no, just use KiCad. It's actually a pretty good one. And so you kind of have like 2 main workflows, which is editing the schematics or editing the PCB layout. And one of the great things about like getting into the hardware engineering side, or one of the great methods of, I guess, getting deeper into that, knowing nothing, is just editing an existing project, not trying to go make your own PCB and circuit and whatever, but just editing an existing open source project to add some feature or fix some issue. And something that I did was add these damping resistors, and that's something that I had learned from my starting to learn about the mechanics of hardware and based on my discussions with friends. And sure enough, You can see this is a before and after of the ringing before adding those dampening resistors. And now the signal looks much more normal and blocky. And so it was pretty cool to see that result. But along the way, I was also like, I don't want a USB-A port on this anymore. I want USB-C because I don't want more cables floating around my desk. I'm trying to modernize it. So like, if you're trying to find a good project or something, take an existing board, add a USB-C port to it instead of whatever they're using, like Mini. And so another really cool part of it is ordering it, generating the Gerber files, and sending them off to get manufactured at JLC PCB or PCBWay. It's so cool to be like, holy crap, like I made this? Is this mine? And this is kind of what it looks like fully assembled. Anyway, that actually ended up fixing the issues. This is what I ended up using for the duration of all my other software research. And so yeah, there's like this is a good way to kind of get started into hardware, the hardware engineering side of things if you're a software person. All right, now things are gonna get a lot crazier. And so Bill Gates' secret Bondwire. So I started getting more adventurous with my hardware antics as I kept digging more and more into this history of the console and all these leaked resources and leaked data sheets and stuff like that. I turned my attention to the MCPX. And this is the South Bridge. And it looks like this. If you've ever heard about the whole story about how Microsoft had to trash or NVIDIA had to trash a bunch of chips and almost went bankrupt because Microsoft was like, oh, we don't want those anymore, like they have an insecure ROM in them. It was this chip. And so the NVIDIA MCPX stands for the Media Communication Processor, and South Bridges typically are responsible for handling peripheral I/O of your computer, things like your USB ports or networking or IDE or SATA or access to flash or the BIOS chip. It's like you don't want networking like your Ethernet wires going straight to your CPU, right? Like you would need a million pins off your CPU for like all the various peripherals. And so everything usually would go through the South Bridge. But there's a really interesting thing in the history of the Xbox. There's actually the MCPX X2 and the MCPX X3. And specifically, the X2 chips were used in debug kits and development kits. And the difference was that they did not have what was historically called the secret boot ROM, the source of the chain of trust. So I was flipping through the data sheet, this leaked data sheet from 20 years ago, 25 years ago now, and something caught my eye. Was reading about this X mode operation somewhere in the data sheet. And I actually don't really like the MCPX data sheet. It does not have as many details I would have liked, but this caught my eye. Essentially, and I realized them talking about the internal ROM being disabled or enabled. This is, again, the first instructions that will boot or run on the CPU out of boot, essentially. But I saw that, oh, wait, OK, I think this is what the difference is between the XM2 chips and the XM3 chips. As one has the retail boot ROM enabled with the security and goes out to all the consumers, but then the development consoles could technically kind of boot anything. But there's this other language that caught my eye, specifically about these internal bond pads. And bond pads being powered off the VDD3 ring, and that this could potentially be toggled. And I was like, what exactly does that mean? And so like any good Xbox modder trying to pirate games, I got the chip X-rayed. And this was like one of the moments where me as a software person stopping to look at this, like, I got the images back from the professional lab, and I was like, it took my breath away. It actually took my breath away. And it was like this really cool thing, because I sent this chip in, and it was just like a chip that was important to me. And just seeing the bond wires expand out and like the BGA pads, I was like, this isn't something you never see in software. But to give a little idea of what you're seeing is essentially there's a silicon die in the center. There's the ball grid array on the bottom, all the little solder balls that will connect the chip to the board. And then there's all these little gold bond wires that are spewing off the silicon in multiple tiers to various pads to route out to the BGA. But I didn't send just one chip to get X-rayed, I sent two. And so like any good reverse engineer, I was like, let me just open it in bindiff. Like I want to compare these chips, but well, not bindiff, bonddiff, because we're going to be looking for differences in the bond wires here. And it pointed me to this region of the chip. And this is what they look like side by side. So the X2, the MCPX X2, the dev chips are on the left, and the MCPX, the retail one, is on the right. And when you start tracing out the wires, I actually went around the whole chip and traced out all the wires. But this is what it looks like. It's still a little bit messy, trying to figure out what's going on here. But if we remove, essentially the blue wires, the teal wires were kind of like the inner row of bond pads, and the red wires I marked as the outer wires. And so now if we take away the blue and we're just looking at the red, we can see that there's something different going on here. And so adding a little bit more topography, we have a ground plane, and then we have what is the 3.3 volt ring running around the silicon. And I saw this little gold bond wire, and I was like, could that be it? Could that be what they're talking about? And it was kind of like seeing gold. I told you we're like digging through things that no people have any sense to be digging through, and I got a little bit of gold fever. And so here it is without the overlays or whatever. If you look carefully, you can kind of see that little black shadow of a wire on the ground plane on the left, and then reaching out to the 3.3 plane on the right. So then we're going to dig for it. And so to give you some sense of scale, this is what the chip looks like. That's my hand. I just have it in like some BGA reballing jig just to hold it steady for now. And we're zooming in a little bit. And here's this little hole. I started hand milling with essentially a grinding pen, a PCB grinding pen. I should have taken a picture of it, but all these pictures are multiple years old at this point. And this is the hole that I started digging down. And so this is about 1 millimeter across. It looks much larger on screen. And I started expanding upon it, and we have the X-rays on the left, and now we have the expanded upon hole. And this was just a throwaway chip on the right. I was just digging to see, okay, am I on the right track here? And so you're peeling back the layers, and on the far right, I ultimately peeled back part of that 3.3 ring. If we zoom in even further, I think I found them, right? I think I found these two little bond wires peeking out down there. And to give you some more sense of scale, that if you, tonight, or even right now, if you pluck a piece of your hair, I'm trying to modify chips, this bond wire that is 3 times thinner than human hair. I'm trying to solder to this thing in this tiny little hole that's about 1 millimeter across. And so for those of you that are familiar with DuPont connectors, this is drawn to scale, I promise. I drew it to scale in Photoshop. And so the entire console security is hinging on this invisible string, one single thread of gold. And I said, all right, let's try to bodge it. And so essentially going back to the data sheet, it looks like I pulled up this part of the 3.3 plane. I think I might now be in PC mode. Maybe the chip is going to be booting in PC mode. I don't really know exactly what the other wire is there. Maybe it's the other bit that can be controlled here. Like, it might make sense. But I have to do something about it. And so this is a side profile of, I've cut into the chip. This is a crater that I have burrowed through multiple layers of the PCB, of the substrate essentially. And those are 2 little gold bond wires sticking out. And so I started using my hair and a little bit of solder mask to start painting around this hole at microscopic scale because I don't have a brush or something that size. And so here I am painting around, trying to mask off all the copper so I don't blow this chip up, leaving just that one little fleck of gold at the bottom. And this is what it looks like. And so I've painted around. It's a little bit hard to see, but there's a shimmer of gold at the bottom. And I was like, okay, great, now what? And so I tried a few different things, but ultimately what I came up with was I learned about this thing called conductive epoxy, which is like this epoxy resin that can be cured with heat. But they have like little bits of silver or like conductive material in there to use this, to pass signals and whatnot. Because the thing is, like, I tried using solder, I tried using paste to try to bodge this, but this is the best solution that I came up with. I don't know, I invite someone else to try to come up with a better one. But the idea was I'd put this conductive epoxy in, I'd put 42 gauge wire into that hole, and hopefully then I've created my own little pin of sorts to this like bond wire. And so this was kind of the plan. I don't really know what I'm doing again. Any hardware person would be like, what is going on? Like, what are you trying to do here? And so I left the other bond wire floating, thinking maybe it'll be 0 volts. I don't really know, hoping that would disable the secret ROM. And then whatever the hell this other wire is, I'm like, well, I should probably hook that back up to 3.3, because otherwise I don't know what the chip's going to do. And so this is roughly kind of what's going on. This is what it looks like. I then masked it over again with some more stuff, because not only have I now done this bodge, But I also have to get the chip back on the board. And so this is a BGA chip, which means I need to put it under this BGA station. And this ignores the whole me taking the chip off, trying not to kill it, and get it reballed and everything. But at this point, I'm putting the chip back on. I've attempted my Bodge. I'm trying to disable the secret ROM, essentially make it a dev chip of sorts. I've disabled the root of trust. And the system still boots, but unfortunately, it's still booting in retail mode. So this was kind of a fail, but no good story happens from things going right. And so I tried a few more times. Unfortunately, it did not end up working out. We just lost a timer, by the way, down here. It was a good attempt, and I tried a few more times. I didn't want to try too much, but it was a fun adventure. I was glad I could at least see that gold Bondwire. I think there's something there, and I invite someone to try again. But it's a very aggressive process. Trying to get the chips on and off the board, as well as doing the Bodge, is insanely invasive. But I kept moving. I moved on to looking at the system management controller for a little bit. And so the system management controller is this part of the board. And it's essentially just a simple PIC16. It monitors, it has a very simple amount of logic. It monitors eject button presses, DVD tray state. It will drive the fan pulse width modulation to set the fan speed and stuff like that. But there's 4 kilobytes of code in this that Microsoft wrote, which is not really significant from a security point of view, but it seems like a really fun challenge. And I worked on this for a little bit. There's a few subtle differences between the retail and dev chips, but it doesn't matter too much. But there's a blog post I linked down there, which is worth pursuing. But here's some of the stuff I was doing. And so this is a chip on just a basic flash reader. It has the readout protection enabled, so I can actually read the chip out, or the secret 4 kilobytes. And so I was trying to use nitric acid. I've never decapped chips before. Like, I don't have a wet lab. Like, I'm a software person again, or tricking myself into trying to be a hardware person. And so I was absolutely destroying some chips. And these were just, you could buy blank chips. You should buy blank chips, not test on your real target, because you might only have one of those. And it was in the middle of winter, and so there's snow on the ground, so I don't want to go outside. So I'm trying to set up by this little window, the most hobo-like chip decapping station ever. But I was incrementally getting better. You just, practice makes perfect, right? And so basically, putting chips on this little hot plate, dropping a single drop of acid on them, trying to expose the silicon die. Because the idea is there's a common attack, which is called like UV erasure attacks. The idea being you can sometimes expose the silicon die and use UV light to erase the configuration bit that would control whether readout protection is enabled. And so I was trying to get down to that, and I was while trying to keep the chip functioning, essentially. And so here it is under UV light. I tried a few things. It was not working. This is essentially another fail, but what we were able to confirm, and I do know some people that are still kind of working on this, and I invite you, if anyone in this audience comes back next year and say, hey, I dumped this ROM, I'll make sure that Peter and Jordan get the talk accepted here. But we were able to confirm that the configuration bits within the silicon are in this small region. So the readout logic is also in that region. And this is a picture from the Fly Logic blog post this is honestly like 10, 15 years old at this point. But the chip is, based on everything that they said, this is one of the more hardened chips, and it has a physical fuse that blows. And basically, they had to shoot a laser to cut a trace in a specific point of the silicon to actually ground out the readout protection fuse line such that they could read it out. And that's a lot of equipment cost, one-time equipment cost that I don't think I would ever apply again, honestly. But like the idea of doing transistor-level reverse engineering is fascinating to me. I did some of it back in college, honestly. But even just doing the polishing and delayering of silicon and imaging it well enough to be able to reverse engineer logic can be expensive, let alone lasering it or using a fib. So that's another challenge I'll put out there. I've given you the ingredients, and this blog post, I think, outlines what you need to do. And so if someone comes up with the delayered pictures, I'm happy to help. I'll dig right into reverse engineering the silicon. For a while, I also started, instead of trying to dump the ROM, just re-implementing it. And so learning how to use logic analyzers with like 30 channels on it, and starting to monitor all the logic and re-implement it on a new ROM myself. And so I got that about 90% done before I stopped. So we'll keep moving on to the next adventure, which is CPU interposers. And so this is what the CPU looks like on the original Xbox. This is an Intel Pentium 3, essentially. It was running at 733 megahertz. Yeah, it was actually a mobile CPU meant for laptops or in the more mobile form factor. But back in the day, there was this legendary console called the DreamX 1480 by this Taiwanese company called Frentech. And what's really interesting is that they had come up with this method of upgrading the CPU on the console to a 1400 megahertz Celeron, which is effectively double the speed of the original CPU speed. And so this is a comparison of the original CPU versus the upgraded one. And this is a server class Tualatin, essentially. And this was considered the pinnacle of the Pentium 3 era. Like, people clung to these CPUs. They're legendary amongst Intel fabs. But you can see the much faster core, much bigger cache size. And one of the big problems, though, is that they have a completely different footprint. One is BJ2, it's essentially a laptop CPU versus socket 370. And this is what they look like. This is the size differential of them. And one is a BGA chip, and one is a pin grid array. It's got 300 gold pins on it. You can literally fit the original CPU within the well of the server class Tualatin. And so the Tualatins were normally designed to be plugged into sockets like this. And so this is called socket 370 or PGA 370. And that's kind of what it would look like. But the solution that Frentech had developed back in the day was to develop this BGA2 to PGA 370 CPU interposer. And you can actually find the patent for it still online on Google. If you search for this, you'll find it. And they have this like nifty little diagram that looks kind of cool. But they also have this like pretty crunchy schematic there. And so I was like, this was a legendary mod back in the day, but a lot of people kind of wrote it off. First of all, it came out towards the end of the Xbox era. There's probably only 100 or 200 of those consoles ever made by this company. And there's a few hobbyists who kind of recreated the interposer or privately and would like, they would sand down the interposer and make their own like over like the years. But a lot of them had kind of dropped off the face of the earth. Like, nobody's heard from them anymore. So it was almost like a lost art of doing these CPU upgrades. But there's one guy on eBay still selling these cloned interposers. I was kind of like, well, what if this dude gets hit by a bus? Like, I think this is a fascinating piece of the history of the console. And I was kind of worried about, like, first of all, I want to do the mod, so I was like, okay, let me get some of those. But then, like, I was also like, what if he just disappears? And so I wanted to learn more about the underlying of it, not just sanding it down and copying something. I actually like learning things. And so I started using the patented schematic or whatever and started rebuilding it in KiCad. So this was like the second or third, like, I think this was essentially like the second board that I had actually made myself in KiCad. There was like one or two very minor projects that I just don't have time to mention in this talk, but so I started laying it out. This is the most advanced thing that I've ever done. I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm starting to try to like figure out the layout and kind of glancing at these ones that I had also bought. And KiCad's pretty cool, so you can also get like a 3D visualization of your board. But then I was like talking with some friends, some of my EE friends, and they're like, oh, why do you have all these dog ears? We have these things called VIA in pad nowadays, which is very accessible to hobbyists. Specifically, and so like, this was me, like the learning process being like, oh, I guess I don't need to like move these over. I can put them on the pads themselves. But to start building my own interposer, I was reading all these Intel, I was spending hundreds of hours reading all the Intel data sheets on which you can find for the old processors back in the day. Like, nowadays, all that stuff is like super NDA'd, super proprietary, all that stuff. But Intel used to publish a lot of platform recommendations and motherboard design references and data sheets for their processors. And so I started building this thing out. And this is going to be a 6-layer PCB. And so most hobbyists normally have a 2-layer PCB, maybe 4, but we need 6 for this. And so I got it laid out, the components, the schematic done, the components roughly laid out, and I start routing this thing, And I keep reading about impedance and guidelines of like trace width and mils for like distance between the packages and the decoupling capacitors, And I keep going, and I keep routing, and I keep reading, and I keep routing. And I keep reading, and there's all this math, and I'm like, holy shit, like, have I gone too far? Like, maybe I should just go back to being a software reverser and writing plugins like IDA Pro, right? And so But then you finally get to the end, and you get these things ordered, and you're holding them, and you're like, holy crap, like I made this thing. So yeah, there's 3 layers of routing for about 150 digital signals, I think, with 2 inner ground planes for shielding and a plane for power routing, some amount of power routing too. Whew. And so now we have to install it. And so this is the retail motherboard before doing any modifications to it. Again, here's a CPU. We have to start by taking the CPU off. And so we put it into the BGA station, we heat it up, we pull it off, the board's a mess, there's all these little solder balls floating around. And so you gotta go through, you gotta wick that all up, and you end up, hopefully you don't tear any pads, like it's a little bit of a process. I also ended up getting these these are called stencil quicks, I think. They're not necessary, but I was like a little bit worried about how aggressive this mod was gonna be, and like I didn't wanna cause bridging under what will be my interposer. You'll see why. And so basically this is like a Capcom stencil that you can actually put down on the board to help with alignment as well as masking of potential vias around, and it was kind of like a neat little trick. And this is what it looked like on the board. And so over the original BGA pads of the CPU. But we actually need to put, so we need to put these 76 or 0.76 millimeter solder balls on the bottom of the interposer. And you can actually see this name, by Risey119. There's a lot of interesting toxicity and drama within these retro communities that I did not realize until I entered. So I had to do most of my stuff quietly and privately and anonymously, because there's some very eccentric personalities in these communities. And so to cause some misdirection and confusion, I would occasionally anonymously publish things under other people's names. And so Risey is someone I know. But yeah, anyway, continuing. So there's quite a bit of precision going into all of this design of the interposer. And so you can actually see, if you look around the corners, there's these 2 little caps that are right next to, that is millimeter, sub-millimeter precision that I was having on both aligning the BGA pads and everything, as well as around components on the motherboard. And so it looks, just seeing me laying out the interposer, it's like, oh, maybe that's not too bad, but there's this landscape that I also have to account for on the board. But you put it down, we put it back under the BGA station, and we run it through a cycle, and we get the interposer attached. But then we have to go through, because we have these pins. It's a PGA chip that we're trying to put onto the interposer. And those pins are normally supposed to go in a socket, but we don't have a socket. We have a bunch of pads. And so you have to go through this almost process of cake pasting this interposer with a different alloy of solder paste, which I'll explain in a second. And this is kind of what it looks like. You have 370 little blobs of low melt solder paste, essentially, on the interposer. And you have to drop the CPU onto this. And these pads are about half a millimeter, and so you have to be so precise. And if you mess it up, you have a little bit of nudging you can kind of do. And this is kind of what's going on. This is what it looks like. So we have this new CPU sitting on top of this interposer, and we have 2 different alloys of solder paste. And the reason that we need that is that they have different melting points. And so we've already attached the interposer, but now we're trying to attach the CPU to the interposer. And if we heat it up too much, it would cause all the balls under the interposer to squish. And so we actually, we use the lower temperature solder paste to just reflow the bismuth paste such that the CPU will now adhere to the interposer without disturbing all of the balls that we have used to attach it to the motherboard. And so, yeah, we go under the BGA station for the 3rd time here. And here it is, just closer up, I guess. And this is right when the process has started, but this is one of the prettiest pictures too, one of those magical moments of me being a software person doing this hardware stuff. I self-titled this as the sacred pines. It almost feels like this holy forest of golden trees and stumps. And so you can see the paste starting to reflow slightly. It's liquefied, and then it turns into this magic, these stumps around the PGA pins. And so this was, again, such a visually striking experience for me as a software person going through all this hardware stuff. All right. So we got the CPU on the board. There's a few other small things you kind of got to do, not really to the BGA station. This is just me kind of like pulling it off. But you have to like tweak the voltage, like the V core or whatever, to be lower. But essentially, yeah, it was time to try booting this thing up. And here it is. The system is booting. And it's like, no party tricks. It's actually booting on this new CPU. You can see it going through the boot animation. I don't have any other hard drives or anything in there, so it's not going to boot into anything. But it was like a crazy adventure to get to this point. Because the thing is, if I misrouted one of the signals to the wrong pad, or maybe the trace length matching that I did was not quite sufficient, or maybe one of the BGA balls bridged, or maybe I forgot a component on the interposer, how the hell are you going to debug those? Like, how do you figure out which part of the process you messed up on? And so you have to be so precise in this, like, I had to be so precise, I guess, in this process of building this thing. And it was like quite this like adventure, and it was so rewarding. But we're not done yet. We got to this point, we got this new CPU on, but how do we even cool this thing? And so I had to start learning how to use CAD tools like Fusion 360. And I started like mapping out the board because, again, I have to worry about the geography. And so like that's the GPU heatsink on there. But I had to design a whole new bracket to go on the board to hold it, as well as this kind of like X-clamp brace that I put on the bottom to help prevent board flux a little bit. So I had to go buy a 3D printer. Never bought a 3D printer before. Like, again, like I'm way out of my depth here trying to learn all this new shit. But I built this. I had to print it in PETG to help withstand potential temperatures around it a little bit better than things like PLA would. And so you don't have to go as far as using carbon fiber nylon, but using PETG at least is good for up to like 100 Celsius or 120 Celsius or something like that. And then again, this was like this X-clamp, because it's interesting because original Xbox motherboards would actually warp a little bit with their original bracket over the past 20 years. And so, but the fact that I was going to be putting a bigger heatsink on this thing and building this new bracket, I'm like, let me build this kind of like stressor clamp. And so, but I had to start figuring out, okay, wait, let me design a heatsink. I've never designed a heatsink before either. Again, I'm a software person. I'm like simulating thermal properties of the different alloys because I'm like, well, just in case, I don't know what's going to happen here. Getting these technical drawings or whatever generated, and finally they arrived. And I was like, oh, damn, these look pretty cool. Like, again, I made this. Like, is this mine? And this is what it looks like. So we finally got to this point of like having this beautiful console that now has this upgraded CPU, and I can play Half-Life in 30 frames per second. And this is what it looks like. So this is a video. It's up on YouTube. And on the left, you can see the retail. On the right, you can see, I actually have the console overclocked. That's a whole other discussion. We're not going to go into that today because we don't have time. But you can see on retail, it's running 13 frames per second. And on the upgrade CPU, we're at 30. And so I tried my best to try to like show side by side what's going on here. And this is Half-Life 2 running on the original Xbox, which was an amazing port by itself. And so yeah, this clip's about a minute. But anyway, Half-Life 2 is a very CPU demanding game, so not every game will benefit from having a CPU upgrade. And there is some really clever stuff that I did on the software side to help resolve this 20-year-old myth of like, oh, like CPU upgrades are a gimmick because it breaks all the games. There is some really clever engineering I did on the software side to essentially repair compatibility to help with virtually all titles on the original Xbox. And that really helped kick off this renaissance of people looking back at these CPU upgraded consoles and this install process in Interposers and be like, wait, we can actually do this. And so this is kind of like the new oh wow, this is the dream to achieve, is getting a CPU upgraded console. So this is also what I would consider probably the most insane console mod that we'll ever see, because there's too many bespoke CPUs and APUs and whatever in the modern consoles that will never be able to replace a consumer part like this again. And so I actually went on to revise the interposer a little bit more now that I'm like, okay, it actually worked. And so I did a little bit of muntzing and cleaned up a few like trace routing, just because I was a little bit picky, and I was like, oh, like we can make it prettier and whatever. But then on the far right, I actually built an entirely new interposer going forward. I'm no longer reverse engineering the past, but I'm building new things. And I'm not really going to talk about it here, but this is what it looks like, because I have a whole blog post on it on the Ret2 blog. And so some of you may have seen this. But what I did is I proved a 20-year-old theory written in a book by the hackers of old that the original Xbox could have been hacked, or the original secret boot ROM could have been dumped using Intel x86 JTAG debugging. And to do that, it was like assembling the infinity stones. I had to find these old bespoke like x86 JTAG hardware debuggers, which are almost impossible to find, let alone the super proprietary NDA software. And then figuring out how to even, first of all, get the signals out of the CPU, and like there's a lot of stuff. But if you go read that blog post, it's an amazing journey. And then even Bunny, that the person who wrote the original book, Hacking the Xbox from back in the day, was like, holy shit. And so it's cool, like this, this trajectory that I went on. But yeah, so the epilogue. So last spring, I abruptly stopped hacking on the Xbox. I was served a non-maskable interrupt that kind of cut to the core of my being. And so 13 years ago, I met an electrical engineer that changed my life. They were tenacious and brutally competitive, intellectual confidant of mine. And they pushed me so much further to do some of the crazy shit that you saw here, more so than I ever would have on my own. And it was a quiet, intensely private space between us. And this was before we found our way out of college and onto these stages. We bonded deeply over our past and constantly challenged each other's ambition. What we lacked in technical talent, we always made up through like sheer willpower. And we didn't always see eye to eye on things, which was so great. We had distinct approaches because she knew hardware and I knew software. But this is how we tested our understanding and motivated each other to dig, not just down to bedrock, but through it. And so in the years following, we went on to found security firms that we once dreamed and schemed about in school. And so in 2017, I founded Ret2 Systems. And shortly after, Sophia founded Margin Research in 2018. The contrasting views, the light and the dark. And we would goad each other on, just two kids thinking we needed to prove something to the world, or maybe just each other. But I valued my solitude, and we quietly spurred one another as we kind of carved our paths through the industry. But when Sophia passed unexpectedly last spring, I took a step back from technical work and hobbyist research and even my own business for a period, just metabolizing kind of the gravity of this loss. And so Sophia was important to a lot of people. I know that. I'm just a small piece of her grand mosaic. But she had much better friends than me. But she's the one person that always pushed me to do crazy things, and she had such a huge impact. So entering my 30s, I kind of asked myself when the next phase of my life was supposed to start. And this was obviously it. It's different for a lot of people, I think, but for me, death was kind of like a doorway, and watching it open into my windowless little cave that I'd squirreled myself away in for so long. It was kind of like light flooding into my dark lab. And she entrusted me with a special part of her spirit and kind of tugged me out of this dark place and pushed me back out into the world, finding my way back onto the stage for the first time in years. And so I promptly dispersed my Xbox collection among the hackers and the friends that I'd made. I got rid of almost everything else, tossing the remainder of my life into this little van, and I left New York. I was like, we got to get uncomfortable and go big again. And it's what she would have wanted. And so I'm starting a new chapter in a new place, no longer in a dark cave, making new friends and reconnecting with old ones all around the world. So if you've been seeing more of me these past 6 months, you know why. And so I cherish every artifact that I still have of Sophia. And I can't replace her presence or grace, but I hope that you recognize her warmth and curiosity next time we meet. Some conclusions. Be ambitious. Ignorance is bliss. When you don't know better, you can do crazy, impossible things. Hug your friends, and special acknowledgements to all the people that helped me for hacking on the Xbox, some that go back 20 years, some of these people that I've known, some of the people I grew up with. Thanks. That's it. If you want to reach out, you can find me doom@aol.com, still chatting with my good old buddies. All right. Thank you. Yeah.
Can I have take pictures? Take pictures of your friends too. That was one of my lessons learned. Another one it looks like too. Bonus slide. What? Yeah, you have bonus slides. This is just an extra. You're leaving it up. Okay. All right. Do you have any questions? Behind you, Peter.
Regarding the PIC 16 and trying to bypass the code protection, my apologies if I missed it, but Are you familiar with the Heart of Darkness attack?
I don't think I'm in the Heart of Darkness chat. I am in the Silicon Prawn
Attack or
Discord.
chat?
Attack. So,
No. I don't think so.
is the pick that you're looking at code protected per page? Like, is there different segments and pages?
I can't remember off the top of my head. And again, some of this research is like 3 years old.
That's fine. I would just, and I'd be happy to talk later too.
Yeah.
The Heart of Darkness attack, I think Andrew Tierney presented it at a B-Sides in the UK. And with some of the PIC microcontrollers, the code protection is configurable per the banks. And so when you overwrite a single bank, you wipe that one. But if you can sacrifice a bank and then get your code, custom code in there, and then you internally write the code to dump the other regions out on the pins, and then you do that with a second chip and you overwrite a separate bank to recover the original bank, that might be a way to do that. And it doesn't work on all the PICs because, from personal experience, that not all of them are the same, but that might work if the code protection is configurable per bank.
I want to say, so it has been a while, but I want to say that it was actually just one readout protection bit. I have heard of like the individual page base, or being able to protect only regions of the code, but I'm pretty sure it was just a single fuse controlling all of readout protection.
Okay.
So, and I did look at PIC family, the prior PIC families and the later PIC families, but this PIC family in particular, the model I listed, seems immune to most of the historical attacks, as well as, and Fly Logic even, we tried all these things, this is what we had to resort to, was essentially using a laser probe station to cut a wire, or a fib, so, yeah.
Did you also happen to try chip whisper or any type of glitching?
I do have some of that stuff. Unfortunately, that's a whole nother talk that maybe will happen one day. And so that is some of the spaces that I moved into post,
Excellent, thank you.
Yep.
Anybody else?
I'm not, and that's a good point. And so Travis Goodspeed, all of you know Travis Goodspeed. I talk with him probably once a year at Recon for a couple hours or something, and he was like, it's not fair to call yourself a software person anymore, and that's true. There's a little bit of imposter syndrome, right, that happens with all trade. And so if you have any hardware questions, you know who to ask now, all right?
All right, round of applause.